What makes American capitalism so different from the free markets you'll find elsewhere in the world? Let's take a walk down memory lane. When it comes to this idea that unchecked free market capitalism is the best way to structure an economy and society, and that government intervention of any kind is necessarily inefficient, bad, and expensive, we can trace these ideas back to Ronald Reagan and messaging that emerged in the early 1980s. Sidebar, if you've ever heard the word neoliberalism, this is the ideology it's referring to: free markets, deregulation, and reduced government spending. So pre-Ronald Reagan, in the World War II and post-World War II era, America had a very different view of titans of industry than we do today. An Elon Musk figure back then, for example, probably would not have been revered the way he is in 21st century American capitalism. We were far more distrustful of the rich back then, perhaps because we had a better understanding of the power dynamic between those with unimaginable wealth and those without it. In the 1930s, FDR denounced leaders of industry who resisted regulation. He called on the imagery of the robber barons, who were like the 19th century greedy, exploitative, mustached, top hat wearing American businessmen, basically the monopoly men, to remind the American people and the titans of industry themselves that exploiting people for profit is not the American way. This was the era of heavily regulated and heavily taxed capitalism in the decades following World War II. The largest American employer in the 1950s, GM, paid an average of what would be the equivalent of $50 an hour to its workers, which is roughly equal to $100,000 per year salary today. It's no coincidence then that this era saw a very large, very prosperous middle class. Of course, it was not widely accessible to all people. Black people, other communities of color, and women were still considered second-class citizens, though it is worth noting that a lot of social movements, like the civil rights and women's movements, came out of this period of prosperity and stability. But the number of individuals who were able to carve out a stable and financially secure middle-class living and support their families on one working-class income was proportionally much larger than it is today. These are the people who could buy homes with just their job money, to quote one of my favorite bleak tweets. One such reason that historians point to: the top marginal tax bracket, the highest amount of federal income tax you'll pay on every dollar earned over a certain limit during much of that period, was 91%. Today, the top marginal tax bracket for people earning more than $523,601 is 37%. Some historians point to the much higher top marginal tax bracket and say that it disincentivized taking an exorbitant salary for oneself because as you earn more incrementally, you get to keep so much less of it. Taxation of this kind was a wealth redistribution strategy. It was taking money from the richest people in society to put it back into the hands, directly or indirectly, but ultimately through government spending, of the regular working class or middle class people. 90 to 99% of the rest of the country. At this time in history, the average CEO made approximately 30 times what the average worker made. For context, today that figure is more than 300 times the amount in the S&P. As an aside on the topic of taxation changes, part of what's worth noting about our progressive tax system is the way in which it becomes far less progressive as you earn more. For example, if I earn $600,000 of taxable income next year, which $600,000, that's a lot of money, right? My marginal tax rate will be the same as someone who earns $10 million next year. My effective tax rate, meaning the total amount of my income that I'm going to have to pay in taxes, would be around 38%. Theirs would be 43%. Just a few percentage points higher, despite making more than 10 times as much. This matters because tax codes are not naturally occurring phenomena. They are law. They are mutable. They are the result of conscious choices. And right now, they're written to advantage the mega rich far more than just the moderately affluent. Anyway, back to the 1980s. So this cultural ethos and these policies that created a very strong middle class and kept the wealth of the rich in check all began to shift with Ronald Reagan and his advisors, including econ's zaddy Milton Friedman. Reagan is the president responsible for reviving Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon's trickle-down economics theory from the 1920s, though I don't believe Reagan himself ever actually called it that. We'll get into some of the key assumptions of trickle-down in a second, but the biggest cultural change was the perception shift about the private and public sectors.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Reagan's administration believed that private industry is inherently efficient because it's driven by incentives of profit maximization, and the public sector is inherently wasteful and inefficient because it's not driven by profit incentives.
The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help."
And it was a real shift in how Americans thought about what types of economic policies netted the best outcomes. We went from criticizing big business for several decades to criticizing big government. And that's basically what knocked down the first domino that got us to where we are today.
You triple our troubles and we're better off than any other people on earth. And we've asked so much of government, and we've gotten in the habit over the last 40 years of thinking that government has the answers. There's very little that government can do as efficiently and as economically as the people can do themselves. And if government would shut the doors and sneak away for about 3 weeks, we'd never miss them.
President Reagan began deregulating energy, public utilities, banking, and finance. He is also widely known for originating the term welfare queen and demonizing recipients of government assistance. And he and his advisors ended a lot of FDR's New Deal programs. This is where we started to see the concept of lazy Americans who kick back and mooch off the system. This trope was almost exclusively portrayed in media and entertainment as Black people, and specifically Black women, based on a mythologized woman named Linda Taylor who committed welfare fraud. So we mentioned deregulation, and I think it's worth putting a finer point on this and mentioning a few patently disastrous and notable outcomes of deregulation. First and foremost, do you remember the 2008 global financial crisis? Because it was indirectly the result of the Commodity Futures Modernization Act in 2000 that deregulated speculative derivatives like credit default swaps, which were, to put it simply, the gambling device that was used to financialize the American housing market in the early aughts. The 1996 deregulation of the California electricity sector, which then promptly caused the 2000-2001 California electricity crisis, and, in 3 words, Enron and WorldCom. Now, Reagan was and is a polarizing figure. My history class girlies may recall that even George H.W. Bush, before he became Reagan's running mate, called his economic policies voodoo economics because he felt it was, to use the technical term, kind of bullshit.
Well, what I said back then, it's very hard to find actually, let me start over. One, I didn't say it.
Economists still, to this day, disagree about whether or not Reaganomics was ultimately successful. Fans of Reagan will praise the economic growth that followed his administration, where inflation went down and American GDP post-1980s exploded. Ironically, tax revenue under Reagan actually went up because of the growth, despite individual and corporate tax rates being cut. So in some ways, it seemed like it worked. The challenging balance to strike, of course, is that as GDP grew, so did income and wealth inequality, which intimates that the class of beneficiaries of such growth is becoming increasingly smaller, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, estimates that worsening wealth inequality has actually slowed our GDP growth in the 21st century. Another complication and misconception is that the US's economic growth from the 1980s until now outpaced the growth of our peer nations in Europe, where incomes are less unequal. But according to World Bank data, that is not the case. While the American economy is richer, the rate of growth has been remarkably similar over time. All that to say, Income inequality is not a necessary side effect of economic or even technological growth, which is another popular reason proffered for why the US economy has grown so unequal in the last 40 years. So while people point to policies in the Reagan era that did achieve what they were supposed to, trickle-down specifically has more or less proven ineffective. The wealth did not trickle down to the lowest rungs of society. It proved to have a thicker viscosity and mostly stayed at the top. The other rather paradoxical aspect of the Reagan administration is that despite all of the anti-big government talk, the government gross federal debt actually tripled under Reagan from $900 billion to $2.7 trillion. The myth that he cut spending is so pervasive because the small government messaging was so effective. And like we said, tax revenue did rise and inflation did slow. So that's how I conceptualize the beginning of American capitalism as we know it today, and I think it's crucial to recognize that this version of our economic system is barely 40 years old.